Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Linwood. I'm actually a mobile app developer in Austin, Texas. And today I am going to be talking about Twilio client for PHONEGAP, which is a really cool way of doing mobile apps without knowing Java, without knowing Objective-C, without knowing Swift. Instead, you can use the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you already know from web development to build cross-platform mobile apps. And so the reason that I'm really excited about this is that one of the projects that I work on is actually the PHONEGAP plugin for Twilio client. And so what PHONEGAP plugin for Twilio client is it's actually sort of a bridge between Twilio's iOS and Android SDKs and the PHONEGAP HTML5 mobile app experience. So in today's session, I'm actually going to talk to you about what goes behind the scenes there for Twilio client. I'm also going to talk about creating an app with PHONEGAP, and then I'll show off a little bit of the plugin, and then we'll do a quick demo of an app that runs on both iOS and Android from one set of code. So it should be pretty cool. A little about me. I'm actually mostly a mobile app developer these days, so this is what I do. I enjoy finding projects all over the place on both Android and iOS, going ahead and figuring out what problems we can solve using mobile. I used to do a lot more on the web side, but I find the kind of small screen size of mobile to be really interesting. I get the opportunity to create really small, really focused projects, and I think that now that everyone's carrying these smartphones with them, that you can have a lot of impact from a mobile app. And the cool thing about it is that you only need really a couple screens on a mobile app to make it really, really useful. I mean, if you think about, okay, I'm going to take this Uber from here to the Oakland airport or whatever, how many screens do you actually need in that app to make it useful? I mean, basically a way to pay, a way to tell them where you're going, and a way to say, hey, come pick me up. And boom, you've got a little app. To me, that's really a lot more exciting sometimes than working on a big web app project with lots of pages, lots of screens, lots of stuff. So I find that mobile is a really interesting way to kind of focus. I've also teach mobile app development at UT Austin, which is really cool. I get to teach students iOS app development. So if you have any questions about just where do I go to learn app development, happy to talk about that. One of the things I'm not is really just sort of all about one technology or another in terms of I'll tell you that Android's the best or iOS is the best, or you always need to be developing with native mobile, or you always need to develop with PHONEGAP. I'm much more of the sort of person that's like, hey, let's figure out what works for the project, what works for you, whatever. So always happy to talk about that sort of stuff. And then a couple of my current projects, one of them that I'm really excited about is Map Rhino, which is the Are We There Yet app for kids on road trips. So kind of cool stuff. Anyway, to talk a little bit about Twilio client, basically, with respect to this is Twilio client for voice. There is a web JavaScript version that some of you may have already used. It's the Twilio client for JavaScript. It's got a really well-defined interface, and you can actually use it everywhere except on the mobile web because the iOS and Android browsers don't support WebRTC yet. So that Twilio has this awesome JavaScript API. You can use it to build really cool apps in Chrome that run on a desktop. You can't use it on mobile yet, and that's kind of a problem. Twilio has client SDKs for iOS. Twilio has client SDKs for Android. Both of those are great. They unlock the power of this Twilio voice stuff to native iOS applications and to native Android applications, but if you're looking to come at things from the mobile web side, you actually can't use these SDKs directly. What comes into the picture here is actually this PHONEGAP plugin for Twilio client. And that's kind of the bridge between the mobile web and these mobile SDKs that Twilio produced. So the whole idea behind PHONEGAP is really that at some day, it will be not needed at all because the actual web browsers running on the phones will have all the power of the native apps. So that at some point in the future, Twilio's web JavaScript client will just run just fine on iOS 12 or Android 8 or whatever it turns out to be when everyone kind of gets everything running correctly on these smartphones. But until we reach that point, we need to have these bridges like PHONEGAP that sort of bridge that gap. And we have seen this gap bridge before. One of the most popular reasons for PhoneGap when it first came out was to allow mobile websites access to the camera. Now that's actually an HTML5 API that you can just use. You don't need to actually use PhoneGap just to get, say, a camera into a file upload in HTML anymore. Same with geolocation. They used to be something, again, just limited to mobile apps. You needed to have some sort of specialized code running. And now, of course, you can just use geolocation from your HTML JavaScript web apps. So moving on, just to talk about Twilio Client. For those of you that have already worked with Twilio Client, there really is no difference between using Twilio Client inside a PhoneGap app or, say, using Twilio Client from a mobile app or from web JavaScript. The server side of this is going to look exactly the same. So we're going to use the Twilio Client capability tokens. You also want to make sure that you don't ship your Twilio credentials on the client side. Just FYI for something that you want to know is that when you ship your, if someone was to get access to your Twilio credentials, your auth token and your account ID, they could use that to do stuff on your behalf that you don't want them to do, which is why mobile apps and JavaScript, in other words, things that you could see as an end user, should use the capability token instead. Some of the example apps that you'll find on Twilio's website for the client are voice chat, conference call, making phone calls, really anything you can do with Twilio Voice. Twilio Client's also really great for staying within the app. For those of you that saw the keynote this morning, there was a lot of talk about, what's the context? Can we make an application that, shares its context across the calls? Well, if you stay within the app, right, and you have a mobile app, whether it's been built natively or it's built on top of PhoneGap, you can actually pass parameters along with your Twilio client connection information so that your CSR agents, for instance, would know, like, hey, this is Jeff Linwood, he's logged in, he's looking at this screen, and this is why he's calling us for help, and maybe it even pops up some sort of parallel view on theirs, if you want to really advance things. So Twilio Client gives you a lot of really cool functionality that, again, you can actually stay within the app. And for those of you who saw the keynote, you're not just clicking the 1-800 number and it pops up, takes you to the old school iPhone dialer. You lose all context. You have to put in your social security number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this really fits in well with what you guys heard this morning. To get to capability tokens, just to talk about those a little bit more, what you'll find is that these are just really, really long strings of text. They're not anything, sort of human readable. They're what's called JSON web tokens, and there are a lot of ways to generate them. There is server code that you can get for pretty much any server library or programming language. Your Python, your PHP, your Node.js, and using your Twilio credentials on the server side, you can create these capability tokens that your web client, your mobile client, just simply requests, gets that token back, and uses that to initialize what's called the Twilio device. And the Twilio device is simply a representation of, basically, I'm on the app, I have this connection to Twilio, and now I have a device that's capable of making either outgoing connections or incoming connections. So you can actually make calls out to a customer service agent, to another phone number. You can implement voice chat, whatever you want to do. Or you can take incoming calls so that you can have a 512 number yourself, and using capability tokens and using a Twilio voice app, basically register, for instance, I can register my mobile app as the client name Jeff Linwood, and then that can be associated with some sort of phone number on the back end. Someone calls that, it goes into a TWIML, like a PHP or whatever, and then it says hey, make a connection, dial Jeff Linwood, and that'll actually come up as an incoming connection on the client. And again, this is all the same whether you're using the web client JavaScript SDK, whether you're using the iOS SDK, or whether you're using Android SDK. Really, the only difference here is the syntax. Here's a capability token example. This is a really simple PHP script that's probably about as simple as it can get. And what this is basically, this is just generating a capability token and returning it as a string of text. So for those of you that have seen something like this before, in PHP it really is this simple. Typically, when you actually build this into an application, you want to put some identifying information to it. So in other words, your mobile app is going to make an authenticated request back to the server, and that's going to be associated with, say, a Jeff Linwood account or what have you. And then it's going to use that to populate this capability with, for instance, my client name or whatever, so that, for instance, if I have a conference call server and I make a connection that creates a conference call, then I'm properly billed for that, for instance. So it uses up some of the minutes that I've already paid for, or what have you. What you can see here is that this particular token server just allows outgoing client stuff. It does not allow incoming, but that would just be one more line of code for the capability. And you can find way more information about capability tokens on Twilio's documentation. This has nothing in particular to do with PhoneGap. It's not PhoneGap specific, but it is really important that you know that if you're going to build these Twilio client applications, that they do use the capability tokens. So let's talk a little bit about server. That's one way that I just showed you is like, hey, here's this really simple PHP script. It can create capability tokens on its own. Another thing you'll find is that Twilio actually has their own mobile quick start. So if you were to click the link here, and I'll put these slides up on my website, if you were to click this link here, that would take you to a Twilio mobile quick start, which you don't actually really need to even know much about the code to get started with. You can take this quick start, click a deploy to Heroku button. That will create a free Heroku application for you. You fill it in with your Twilio credentials, and now you have a working server that runs on Heroku that takes your credentials and you can use for whatever purposes you want. So this is really cool. And of course, this being your own web application running on your own instance of a Heroku app, this is something that you could actually just edit yourself, tweak, get started, whatever. So, and again, this is just really cool. You can use this mobile quick start whether you're doing iOS, whether you're doing Android, whether you're doing a PhoneGap app. Your actual server is probably going to be something that is built into whatever application you're building. A CRM type tool, a customer service type tool. It just depends what exactly you're building. So now I've talked a lot about Twilio Client. So Twilio Client, we have information. It's really cool. You guys have maybe worked with that before. But now let's talk a little bit about PhoneGap. And for those of you that find this kind of interesting, so last summer I went to Katmai National Park in Alaska, which is really cool. It would totally be terrible if you're a Twilio developer, though, because there is no internet, no phone service, no Wi-Fi. It's just you and these bears. But we took all these photos up there, and it's really cool. So definitely go up there. So to get started with PhoneGap, and one thing I want to bring up is that there is an enormous source of confusion, which is pretty much self-made, with regards to you'll see things called PhoneGap and things called Cordova. And the underlying thing there is that basically PhoneGap, the name belongs to Adobe, and Cordova is the name of the open source project. However, you will find things named both when you use even just the open source side. So it is, I do find this PhoneGap versus Cordova thing to be very confusing. You will see references to both. And PhoneGap basically refers to commercial services that Adobe provides now, and Cordova refers to open source stuff that belongs to the Cordova Apache project. But in practice, they really mean the same thing. So to get started with PhoneGap, it helps to have a Mac if you're going to actually do iOS development, because you'll need a Mac to install Xcode, and without Xcode, you can't use this Twilio plugin. So I would say that yes, it's cross-platform, but to do stuff that is iOS specific, in particular this Twilio client plugin, you will need to integrate it using an Xcode IDE on a Mac. However, you can develop everything in Android Studio on, say, Windows or Linux, or for instance, Mac. You will need, you actually can do almost everything here, and then, for instance, go to iOS at the end if you can just borrow Mac or whatever. But this is something that I want to make pretty clear, is that you do have all these really interesting things you can do with just Android Studio and with just the Java Android SDK. Cordova uses Node.js, so you'll have to have Node.js installed on your machine as well. including NPM. That's actually how you're going to install Cordova and PhoneGap. And then last at the bottom, I just want to throw this out there, is that you also can install the iOS simulator module there for Node, and that will actually let you run the iOS simulator from the command line with your PhoneGap apps, again, on a Mac. So just to kind of like clarify things, Android development, you can do that on Mac, you can do it on Linux, you can do it on Windows. iOS development, you can only do on a Mac. However, the cool thing is when you develop using the Twilio client PhoneGap plugin, you can actually develop everything on Android, test it out yourself, and just say like, okay, let's port to iOS at the end. And the whole idea is that it should work. The APIs are the same on the actual PhoneGap plugin. And then if you built your app using standard HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that'll also work as well. OK, so talk a little bit about PhoneGap plugins. I brought this up a little bit earlier in the session, but these plugins really bridge the gap between a mobile website and a mobile app. So it's really the difference between going to a mobile website in Safari or going to a mobile website in Chrome on your Android app, and getting a web application, and then actually getting a mobile app that you would download from the App Store or from the Google Play Store. You'll find that in the PhoneGap world, there are standard plugins for your phone's capabilities, like the camera and like the file system, that aren't necessarily exposed by HTML5 APIs. Again, HTML5 has really helped out a lot here with PhoneGap and with mobile web in general in terms of making much richer APIs available. One of the other things you'll find is that there are a lot of third-party plugins to wrap native libraries. One example of that really is the Twilio Client SDK, in the sense that Twilio Client's SDK, it runs using a lot of native code. It can't really run as just JavaScript. And so these third-party plugins wrap these native modules so that you can access them in JavaScript and not in the underlying Java or the underlying Objective-C. Typically, these third-party plugins are cross-platform if the developers can make them cross-platform, so that if you have an Android SDK for like a crash reporting app, a crash reporting plugin or something like that, or an iOS plugin for some sort of analytics tool, usually those plugins are cross-platform, so you can use them across Android or iOS. And typically, a lot of times, these third-party plugins aren't necessarily maintained by the provider. So Twilio has its client SDKs. The PhoneGap plugin's not maintained by Twilio, the company. As a matter of fact, it was actually made by a guy named Steve Graham, who built it for iOS. And later additions to kind of keep up with Cordova and PhoneGap. One thing about Cordova and PhoneGap, they move very, very quickly, so that the PhoneGap ecosystem and the way you develop has changed over the past couple years very quickly. And so these plugins sort of need to march in step. They do maintain backward compatibility. However, you do need to sort of make sure that your plugins keep up with the stream of changes. In addition, Twilio itself can update the client SDK. And that could potentially affect the PhoneGap plugin or any other third-party plugins, because it's basically a bridge. It takes JavaScript commands and translates them over to Java or to Objective-C and then executes them. Later, I added Android to this API so that we have a PhoneGap plugin for Twilio that not just runs on iOS, but also runs on Android with the same API. And that took a decent amount of work to kind of make sure that everything matches, so that one application running on iOS can also run on Android as well. And this is a very similar API to the JavaScript SDK that Twilio provides. However, it is not exactly the same. And part of the reason for that is that the Twilio Android and iOS client SDKs are slightly different from the web SDK, and so that some of the functions that are available on those are not available in the JavaScript SDK. And then a few of the other things just relate to the fact that in PhoneGap, a lot of the functions, they take callbacks, and in the web SDK that Twilio provides, some of the methods there don't take callbacks. So the API is very, very similar. However, we're not quite at the point where you can take your Twilio web JavaScript code and run it unmodified inside of a PhoneGap application. That would be very cool, though. OK, so installing the Twilio plugin, Basically, I do have a very nice PDF if you go to my website, and there's a link to it after this. But jefflinwood.com, I put up a PDF of all the steps you'll need to actually install the plugin on both Xcode and on for Android. So it's like a step-by-step of like, hey, I've got PhoneGap installed according to their directions. I've got all the prerequisites installed. And now it's like, okay, how do I go ahead, create that PhoneGap application, install the PhoneGap plugin, and then install the Twilio SDKs. So this kind of walks you through a couple screenshots. If you have questions about that, obviously I'm happy to help out because it's nice to have a installation document I can point people to. And if some of that's not quite clear, I'd be happy to fix it. And that'll be on jefflinwood.com. You can download it now or whatever. But basically, if you follow the directions in the GitHub README, you can install the plugin. The plugin will give you a couple additional directions to follow after it executes on the command line, and they'll be basically saying like, hey, you need to go out and put this library here, put this library there. Just follow those directions, and again, that's in that PDF. So here's a link to the PDF installation guide. That jefflinwood.com will also be where I put the slides for this, in addition to on Speaker Deck. It's also, the Android side is not really that hard. The Xcode side is a little bit more complicated. Just simply, there's a few more moving parts to get this working for iOS. But and if you're not familiar with it, like you've never opened Xcode, then hopefully this will make things seem a lot smoother and a lot cleaner, and it'll actually work, and you won't just get like a big red exclamation point error with no idea of how to fix it. But of course, you can always reach out to me and be like, hey, here's a screenshot. This doesn't work. What's up? Not a problem. So we actually have a demo of the PhoneGap app. So what I have here is actually a really simple PhoneGap application. All it basically does is it provides a way to make a phone call to an arbitrary phone number using my Twilio account. And over here, this one here is actually an Android app. So this is running what's called the Android emulator. This comes free with like Android Studio or with the Android SDK. And it's a very simple basic version of an Android phone that actually runs on your computer. I would recommend that if you're going to develop for Android, that you actually use it on an Android device. However, this emulator does work for Twilio client as well. But definitely, I would recommend testing on an actual device, especially before you put anything into the Play Store or into the App Store. And over here, we have the same exact application, so same exact HTML, same exact JavaScript. And this is actually an iOS application running what's called the iOS simulator. You can run this iOS simulator for free, but to actually run an iOS app on your phone, you'll need to pay Apple $99 a year to be part of their Apple Developer Program. That lets you run apps on your phone. It also lets you publish apps to the App Store. So that's something else to know. This is different from the web, where you can just publish anything you want for free. Both the App Store and the Google Play Store are, you have to play by their rules. So that is actually my phone number if you wanted to call me. And hopefully, it'll actually call up on this. Oops, I already hung up on myself. Okay, so it's actually calling me. And this guy's actually ringing. And we'll probably get some weird echo effect because I'm now calling this and then talking through this. And we can do the same exact thing on the Android app as well. Oops. Okay, and I just called myself again, which is kind of cool. I'll hang up here. So these are just really simple Twilio client applications, but you'll find that really when you integrate Twilio client, whether it's into a web application or a mobile application, It really is just a matter of how do you configure the server. In other words, like if I take that phone number, where does that go? And or for instance, does this call some sort of customer service agent and pass parameters? So it is pretty simple. And the cool thing is that all of that really just came from one indexed HTML file. And so this happens to be using jQuery mobile, but this is all it is. And then here's the JavaScript that makes it all work. And it really is just mostly a matter of handling a couple of Twilio device stuff that is very similar to the web JavaScript in terms of what do I do when I get an incoming connection? What do I do when I connect? What do I do when I disconnect? And this code would actually be more or less the same whether we were doing Twilio client on mobile for iOS or Android, or whether we were doing Twilio client for PhoneGap, or whether you're doing Twilio client for web. You can basically see that, like, hey, when there's a connection, we successfully establish the call, we basically make the dial button show and hide the hang up button or whatever. And this is very basic stuff, but this really just kind of exercises the Twilio client SDK to see, like, hey, this is what I can do with it. So with that, I just want to say thank you. And I'm going to post the slides for this up onto my website there, Jeff Linwood. And if you have feedback, please text to that number there. And please provide feedback. It's definitely exciting to hear. And if you want to reach out to me directly, feel free to contact me at Jeff Linwood. For those of you that took a picture of my phone number when it's up on the screen, feel free to call me. Totally fine. Also, jlewin@gmail.com, answer that. Whatever. Come find me afterwards. But I'm always happy to talk about mobile, happy to talk about web, whatever. So yeah, feel free to reach out. Feel free to play with this. Feel free to break the PhoneGap plugin. It is up for breaking. And with all of Twilio client's changes that were just announced today, of course, there will probably be some more development needed. So if you want to jump in on that, obviously appreciated. So as soon as that kind of gets out to the public or whatever, I guess we could probably integrate with this. So anyway, thanks everybody.